Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Trevor Burnard. Hello, Professor Bernard. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. It's nice to be talking to you.
Yes, it's a pleasure for me to be talking to you. I get to interview that distinguished academic who the teachers and students alike both greatly appreciate.
Well, that's very nice of you.
Yes, you're very humble. So, Professor Bernard, last year you produced a groundbreaking paper titled Slaves and Slavery in Kingston, 1770 to 1815. In the history of slavery in Jamaica and the wider Atlantic, Kingston was quite central. But as you write in the beginning of your article, most historians, with the exception of a few people like Barry Higman and Wilma Bailey and Lorna Simmons, who study Kingston as students, the history of Kingston has been unexplored.
Yes, that's right. It's very curious, although I can try an explanation if you'd like me to tell you about that.
Yes, please do.
Yes, well, the simple reason is that in many ways when we think of Jamaica, we think overwhelmingly of the plantation, overwhelmingly of the large majority of enslaved people, up to 80%, 90% at some stages, who worked mostly in sugar on the plantation. And certainly there was a well-developed school of historians and economists, people like George Beckford back in the 1960s, thought very much that Jamaica was a plantation society. It was a plantation society, but one of the things that historians have been discovering in the last 20 years or so is that Jamaica was much more than that. It had more than sugar. It had things like other crops like coffee in particular, but it also had a strong city, a strong town, and that was Kingston in the 18th century. It's an important town, both where the majority of enslaved people arrived, where most of the business of the colony was done, and with strong links to other places in the Caribbean, notably in the Spanish America. So we're starting to realize how important Kingston is, but at the moment, very few people have looked at Kingston. Indeed, most of the work on Kingston has been done by people you mentioned or by myself, and it's a prime place for people to look at more what Kingston is, because the experience of enslaved people, the experience of slavery in Kingston was different from the rest of Jamaica.
Kingston ought to be situated in the broader historiography of urban centers in slavery. So for instance, in Barbados, I have read articles on the role of women in the urban slave economy.
That's right. It's certainly it's a bigger and better Bridgetown, you might say. It's bigger and better Port Royal from the 18th century, and it is during the British period up until the American Revolution. It was the fourth biggest town in terms of population, but easily the wealthiest town in British America. It's also the British American town in the 18th century and to 19th century as well, which has the largest population of enslaved people. Around 60% of the population of Kingston at any one time was enslaved, which means that it's got more white people, more people of color, more free people of color than other places in Jamaica, but it's very heavily a place dominated by the enslaved and their families.
I'm happy that you're saying that Kingston was wealthy, because Jeremy Black, in his new book, A Brief History of Slavery, argues that at one point in history, wealthy Jamaicans were actually more affluent than wealthy foreigners, people were residing in North America. And I'm also familiar with the paper you did with Jeffrey Williamson, arguing that income inequality during slavery in Jamaica was rather high. I actually interviewed Jeffrey.
Yes, well, I mean, that was a revelation. I mean, Jeremy gets his information mostly from me, from work that I did time ago, up to about 20 years ago, which says that Jamaica was overall, in terms of wealth, the wealthiest colony in America, and the richest people within Jamaica, the planters and merchants, were the wealthiest people in British Empire, and some of the wealthiest people in Britain. If you think of someone like Thomas Hibbert, Hibbert House still exists in Kingston. That's where the National Trust is now. Someone like Thomas Hibbert, the greatest slave trader in Kingston, probably left up to £500,000. Well, that's a princely sum, the sort of money that a duke would have. In contemporary terms, it would be many hundreds of millions of pounds. So the wealthiest people were very wealthy, and that's work that I've done over many years. But what I've increasingly realized is that Jamaica was so unequal. The richest people were very rich, but the majority of the population, who of course were enslaved people, were kept levels of subsistence, and particularly on the plantations, but even in Kingston itself, they scraped a living in many ways. So Jamaica is both the wealthiest and the most unequal place on earth before the American Revolution.
And what's also striking about Jamaica during this period, Trevor, is that free people of color were also spectacularly wealthy. So for instance, the Moncrief family in St. Anne, the Moncriefs were quite powerful. And Simon Taylor, a planter who resided in Jamaica, he was one of the wealthiest men in this part of the world.
Well, Simon Taylor was probably the wealthiest man in the British Empire at that stage, because he's a white planter in this period. Free people of color, some are wealthy, not as many as you might think. And this is one way where Jamaica is different from some of the colonies, say, in the French Caribbean, Saint-Domingue, which later became Haiti, of course, and other parts of the Caribbean. Because after the great shock of Tacky's revolt in 1760, which is a great big event in British imperial and also in Jamaican history, wealthy white Jamaicans would often given large amounts of money to their offspring with coloured women, to use the phrase that they used at the time, or with enslaved women. White people became very suspicious of free people having a lot of money, so they implemented very much rules whereby wealthy people, free people couldn't inherit very much. Take an example: Thomas Hibbert's only daughter was the daughter of a free person of color, with his house, a child he had with his housekeeper. By right, she'd be the greatest heiress in the British Empire, but she was given relatively small amounts of money in comparison with his white relatives in Britain. So free people of colour certainly were. Some of them were quite well off. The Moncriefs, as you mentioned, certainly is a case of that in the far eastern suburbs. But most of them are kept relatively poor. What the white people wanted to do was to have a society very much based on colour, with white people being a separate caste to free people of colour, which would be an intermediate caste, which would support white people against enslaved people. Of course, free people of colour had different views than that, and they tended, over time in particular, to support people who were enslaved rather than people who were white, leading in the 1860s, of course, to Morant Bay. So Jamaica, but one of the things that I want to say with this particular, when I work on Jamaica, is that Jamaica is a more complicated place in the 18th century and 19th century, and a more interesting place than we sometimes think.
Yes, Jamaica is overly fascinating. So just recently, I was reading a piece by Daniel Livesay. I'm sure you're familiar.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, and he was writing an article on free people of color in Jamaica and their relationship to the legislative system. And he provides a litany of free people of color who petitioned the legislature in Jamaica for various reasons, and some obviously were wealthier than others. But whenever I'm reading articles on free people of color, I'm always impressed by the agency of women.
Well, that's right. There were more free women of colour than there were free men of colour. Free men of colour are important as well, and that talks about the particular sexual dynamics of colonial Jamaica. It was quite customary for white men to take a partner as a woman of colour, either to use the terms, either mixed race or of African descent. So people of colour very strongly women, and Kingston itself was a very female orientated place. It wasn't dominated by women. There were more men than women in Kingston, but proportionately there were more women in Kingston than there were in the plantation. So it was sort of a place where you had women traders, women merchants, women providing services, sometimes sexual, sometimes in terms of food or luxury products, to people coming into Kingston. And these would include both white women and would include free women of colour as well. I mean, if I can give a recommendation, there's a great book by Christine Walker called Jamaica Ladies, which talks about that for the early 18th century and talks about how important the role of women were in this. This is another way in which we're starting to see Jamaica as a little bit different. When I first wrote on Jamaica back in 1991, I concluded saying that white women were irrelevant to the Jamaican economy. Well, I've been proved wrong, but many cases since then. White women in Jamaica and free women of colour and enslaved women were absolutely vital to the Jamaican society and economy. And you saw that most of all within Kingston, which was more orientated to women than any other place in Jamaica.
I didn't read Christine's book, but I've read her articles, and I recently completed a piece written by her where she gives examples of white women who had no choice but to become entrepreneurial. After all, the mortality rate was high, their husbands died, therefore they were responsible to take care of the businesses. So they had no option but to be entrepreneurial. And many of them created successful businesses without marrying again.
That's right. And it's an interesting thing. The ideology of white women is that they were simpering creatures. The ideology of women, the way they portrayed white women in the literature of the time and later on, is that white women were useless, were simpering people who didn't have any role within the economy at all. That's why I wrote in 1991 what I said about white women being irrelevant to the plantation economy. And you can see that in various depictions of white women up to the present day. I mean, if you look at Andrea Levy's Long Song, particularly the TV version of it, which I'd really recommend as a great way of understanding what slavery was like in the 19th century, the white woman depicted is depicted in a very unfavorable light. But actually, white women were pretty important. They were pretty important, certainly in places like Kingston, where they took up entrepreneurial matters with aplomb, where they lived in what you might call irregular sexual liaisons with white men, sometimes often choosing not to marry, because if you married, all your property went to your husband, so they chose not to marry and retained their wealth, and being involved in all sorts of activities, including slaveholding. White women are very heavily involved, just as white men were in slaveholding. So and you see this in Kingston in particular, which is a highly heterogeneous, diverse place right from the very start. It has people from all around the world. It has not only people descent and Scottish descent, but it has lots of Jewish people in the town as well. It has large numbers of white women. It has large numbers of free people of colour, particularly women, and of course it has a huge variety of people from Africa, coming from near North Africa right down to places like Angola. So it really is a cultural melange of places of things. It's one of the most heterogeneous, one of the wealthiest, and also one of the most unequal places on Earth. It means that it was a place of great fascination for people in the 18th century. When people arrived in Kingston, they just they know what to expect, and it was a place which was so out of the ordinary in comparison to what they might have come to from either coming from Africa if they were enslaved, Europe if they were coming to do business, etc. That's a very interesting place, and of course it's a place which suffered huge amounts of mortality, so that the likelihood of death hung over people in Kingston in all sorts of ways.
Excellent summation. Furthermore, if we're going to talk about women during slavery, we must refer to Black enslaved women who anchored the internal marketing system.
That's right. That's right. There's great work, particularly by people like Shauna Sweeney, who's now at
Sean
University of
Sweeney.
Toronto, and talks about it talks about enslaved women being involved in marketing produce in markets of Kingston. They, of course, are the ancestral forebears of higglers, a well-known Jamaican phenomenon. But they're also connected to what white women were doing in the earlier part of the 18th century as well. So Jamaica is a place of great commerce. It's got international commerce, the slave trade with Spanish America, but it has very vibrant domestic commerce as well, which is participated by people of all colors, but especially by enslaved people and especially by enslaved women. I mean, and so that if you think of Kingston, you would see slave markets, as they're called at the time, where the people were enslaved women selling plantation produce, but also a little bit they got from ships, from dealing with with white people, and selling mostly to other enslaved people as well, which makes slavery seem a bit different than what we usually think of it, when we usually think of slavery as being the brutal form of slavery that we saw on a slave plantation. In Kingston, it's more varied, more entrepreneurial, and quite different in those ways.
And some of these slaves became relatively affluent. They were able to improve the state of their homes. They were able to acquire better clothing. So it led to greater female agency.
That's what I think. I mean, one thing is that since we have so little information about Kingston, we don't really have information on this, and some of the sources are hard to see, but hard to establish. But all the information I get is that enslaved people in Kingston had much more opportunity to make money for themselves than enslaved people on the plantations. They were often hired themselves out. So in other words, they became wage employees while still officially enslaved. And some of that money would go to providing for their own needs, to making themselves richer, and of course for freeing themselves, so that far greater number of manumissions, or people emancipating themselves through buying their freedom from their enslavers in Kingston than anywhere else, which means that enslaved people in Kingston are notably more entrepreneurial, notably wealthier, and notably involved in slavery themselves. I mean, you have the strange circumstance of an enslaved person, well, we're not officially owning, but having the use of enslaved people to make money for himself, which wasn't meant to happen within slavery, but certainly did.
Yes, I'm familiar with a rare case of a slave owning a slave in Guyana, and I'm also aware that during the process of seasoning in the Caribbean, the planters had to protect the new slaves from becoming the proto-slaves of established slaves, because some of them abused, some of the slaves who were responsible for seasoning could abuse their power.
That's right, and I think that's one of the things that historians increasingly realizing is the more we look at enslaved communities, the more varied they are. And of course, an enslaved community has some degrees of solidarity with each other, but there's also a good deal of exploitation. I mean, you have, it's not surprising that more established slaves would take advantage of new slaves, or people new to slavery, and try and exploit them in all sorts of ways, which says something, I think, also about just the nature of slavery in century Kingston and Jamaica. It's a particularly brutal and exploitative, to the extent that most people are trying to exploit other people, whether they be enslaved or whether they be free.
And there was great competition between native slaves and African slaves, and native slaves were often preferred.
Well, that's certainly the case. I mean, although a lot of this is planter, and one of the difficulties we always have as historians looking at colonial Jamaica is so much of our evidence comes from planters, and so often planters have their own their own theories. And to take a particular example, what we're increasingly realizing is that Jamaica had a very strong orientation towards the Gold Coast, to Coromantee slaves.
Yes.
That sort of things. So people like Vincent Brown, whose prize-winning book on Tacky's Revolt attributes it very much to the Coromantees, talks about that African heritage. That's true. But we also know that planters had an inbuilt prejudice to try and say that most of the problems in slavery came from unassimilated Africans who did not understand slavery, whereas Creole slaves actually did. So you have people like Edward Long, the great historian of Jamaica, a Jamaican of English descent, whose book makes a very strong distinction between African slaves and Creole slaves, or native-born slaves, and urges Jamaicans to try more of the latter. He even goes to saying that they should abolish the slave trade. Was he right? Was he not right? It's hard to say. Certainly, one of the things that I would suggest is that the divisions that planters thought existed between Africans and native-born slaves, Creole slaves, existed anywhere near the same extent that they thought, and that Creole slaves were by no means faithful slaves, to use the planter terminology. If we look at slave rebellions, we see that deal of rebellion from people who are Creole or native-born slaves. And that comes back to Kingston, is that Kingston probably has a larger number of people who are native-born, and a larger number of, like say, privileged slaves in that particular city, but it's by no means immune to slave rebellion. Indeed, there's always a simmering possibility that the enslaved people in Kingston will rise up. And it's much easier for people to rise up in Kingston than elsewhere. I mean, they're in a vibrant town, they have lots of movement, lots of freedom, all the houses are made and sitting next to each other, and so they easily could be burned down. I mean, Kingston burns down in 1882, not, I think, because enslaved people set fire to it, but just through natural accident. But the possibilities of slave rebellion in Kingston were always very strong, and so what planters thought was divisions between native-born slaves and Creole slaves, I suspect, are as much in the imagination of enslavers as they are in reality.
But notwithstanding this argument, African slaves played a prominent role in slave rebellions, like Taki, for example.
Absolutely, that's very much an African-led rebellion. It's an interesting thing. I mean, the name we call it Taki's Revolt because it's named after Taki. Pretty clear that the leader of this revolt was a man named Wager or Apongo, a rather extraordinary slave in Westmoreland. He was a lieutenant who actually didn't do very well, because he started a rebellion before he was ready to do so. But all of the slaves and the slave rebels in these rebellions tended to be African, and that certainly is the case. Later scares or possible rebellions in the mid-18th century, right up until the 19th century. By the time, of course, we get to the rebellions in the 19th century, particularly the Baptist rebellions of 1831-32, these are largely led by native-born Christian slaves. So one of my points would be that Africans and native-born slaves were, contrary to what planters thought, always willing to resist and occasionally to join in rebellion. But we need to keep in mind that one of the things that people often ask about Jamaica is why more rebellions. I mean,
exactly, Trevor. I don't want to cut you, but I was just getting this point. Jamaica was fairly rebellious.
It's by the standards of most places in the British Atlantic world, it's pretty rebellious. And there's always the threat of rebellions later on. But when you look at it, there are two very major rebellions, 1832 and 1760. And there are a small number of rebellions in the 17th century and a small number elsewhere. So in one way, we could say, yes, that Jamaica is full of rebellions. But on the other hand, we'd also say that most of the time, Jamaicans were not enslaved people in Jamaica were not rebellious. And there's good reasons for it. I mean, people often ask, well, why did enslaved people not rebel more often? Well, the result of rebellion was was likely to be that you would die a very grisly death. It's a very brave or foolish person, or someone who's desperate, who would enter into rebellion. And the fact that there's any rebellions at all, I think, says something just about how brutal slavery was, and how much enslaved people, or a proportion of enslaved people, had given up hope about doing this. And one of the themes of my work, certainly in terms of my book on Thomas Thistlewood, in terms of a lot of my work on the white planter class, one of the things that I really want to argue is I want to show people what enslaved people were up against. And they were up against formidable foes. They were up against people who were making a large amount of money, who were determined to keep enslaved people oppressed, who were willing to use violence and extreme violence at time. Given all that, it's amazing that there were any rebellions at all. And the fact that there were so many rebellions says something about, one, the brutal nature of Jamaican slavery, and secondly, the willingness of at least some enslaved people to say, I'm just not prepared to live under slavery, and consequences, even if those consequences are very dreadful.
Two quick points, Professor Bernard. So I'm not an expert, but I do enjoy researching the Asante Empire, because many of the slaves were forcefully taken to Jamaica came from the Asante Empire or its dependent. The Asante Empire was a militaristic empire, and its subjects were also aggressive. So this could be one reason why enslaved Africans in Jamaica were more likely to revolt during the early years of slavery, because they were coming from a space where they were usually involved in battles.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things we increasingly realize is that Jamaica was a very military society. It was military on the white side. An awful lot of white Jamaicans, sailors or soldiers in imperial wars that existed. There were large numbers of British sailors in Jamaica. But there are also a lot of Africans who were, as you mentioned, part of aggressive empires like the Asante Empire. Wager, for example, or Pongo, who was a leader of the rebellion, which we call Taki's Rebellion, had been a military chieftain in Dahomey, and had also been involved in the 7 Years' War, fighting in that way. And the other thing as well is that enslaved people not only had an African background, but they had been involved in warfare. Many of them, many of the men, were involved in war when they came to Jamaica. They were often put into the British Army as soldiers, and formed the West Indian regiments in the 1790s. So one of the things that often drives people like myself and people like Vince Brown and other people who look at 18th century Jamaican society is to see that it's a very military society, a society at war, sometimes a cold war, sometimes a hot war, and that both sides, the white people and the black people, contained large numbers of people who were experienced violence and were prepared to use violence against each other. It means that Jamaica is a very volatile society, and everybody in Jamaica knew that, that it was easily the most volatile society, probably in the Caribbean as a whole. The only exception might be San Domingue, which later became Haiti.
And the second point is that, as Aaron Graham points out in his work, even on the eve of abolition, the state in Jamaica had the capacity to suppress revolts.
Absolutely. I think that's very much underestimated. Jamaica was a military society in ways that places in America weren't. White Jamaicans liked soldiers and sailors. They liked to give themselves military honorifics. So everybody who was important was a colonel or a major that in Jamaica. They loved having British officers. So people like Lord Nelson, who loved Jamaica, people like William, the Duke of Clarence, later the William IV, loved the Caribbean, because these are which really liked military people. So they always had lots of soldiers and sailors around, and they were willing to use force against people when they could. As well, of course, they have Maroons who occupy an ambivalent place within history, people who are of African descent who have their own freedom, but also with the British to engage in chasing runaways and
suppressing revolts like Taki. They suppressed the Taki revolt and other revolts.
That's right. If you look at Taki's revolt, which of course is held in the middle of the war, what you see that it's put down by a very competent governor who uses British sailors and British soldiers, but also employs the white militia, and most importantly, employs Maroons, who are the sort of vital element certainly in keeping the enslaved people, enslaved rebels down. Without the Maroons, it might have been, the story might have been away. But one thing I'd emphasize is just, one, how violent Jamaica was and how willing people on all sides, but particularly the white side, were to use violence in order to keep the stream of money coming into from their plantations to live well.
And we also have examples of slaves deploying violence against each other. For instance, in the arena of domestic violence, male slaves would abuse their female spouses, and there were also other conflictual issues. So, for example, if one enslaved man was having an affair, his girlfriend would attack his lover. There are examples of this in books and articles.
I think so, and I think it's a very interesting point, and it points to a change in historiography, and it's a difficult change because we have to tread very warily on in this particular topic, because on the one hand we know very much that the oppressed class were enslaved people, and the people who were the oppressors were white people. But what we're increasingly realizing, and I think a number of historians have been looking at this, is that within the communities, you have a lot of enslaved people who are traumatized by their experience. They might, which means, and traumatized people, we know, indulge in all sorts of things. They might kill themselves. Certainly, if I look at Thistle Plantation, there are a lot more suicides than you might expect. Also will be involved in domestic violence and all those sorts of things. So it's very much what Orlando Patterson, a great Jamaican sociologist and historian, he talks about Jamaica as being a Hobbesian society. And it's not quite what Hobbes was saying, but what he meant by that was that it was a war of all against all. And so within the enslaved communities, you see some solidarity in some community, but you also see a lot of divisions as well. I would tend to emphasize the solidarity in the communities. I think that plantations, that enslaved people on plantations work themselves into reasonably viable communities. But one of the things that was a problem for enslaved people is that you had very little mechanisms to counter any enslaved people who was doing wrong. I mean, the examples that you're just given. What happens if an enslaved person wants to use violence against another enslaved person? There's no police force, there's no mechanisms within the slave community to stop someone. And the only way that you really get someone to stop doing that is by using the authority of whites. So it means that enslaved people are in a very difficult sort of situation. They're reliant on whites who they would try and overthrow if they had the opportunity. Day-to-day existence, they were reliant on their oppressors just to make sure that they were able to live and to survive. And the more you learn about 18th century Jamaican slavery, not just in the countryside, but also in Kingston, the sheer brutality of it really comes to the fore. It's very hard even reading about what happens on the plantation in this period.
And because enslavers knew that this enslaved community was not always united, it became easier for them to appropriate enslaved labor as a tool to squash revolts. Not only the Maroons, but enslaved people themselves were also involved in counter movements.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, there are great divisions, which within slave communities, which means it's bearing those in mind. It's hard to imagine how any slave rebellion actually occurs. So Taki's revolt is quite extraordinary in that way, developed in secret, found out by accident, and indeed implemented without whites even knowing much about it. It's an extraordinary effort on the part of the conspirators, given that there's so many opportunities for white people to learn about enslaved revolts or enslaved people doing from other slaves. And of course, one of the characteristic ways in which enslaved ruled on communities was dividing and ruling, was by playing off one group of enslaved people against another group of enslaved people, which means that I think one of the things we need to do is to look more, if we can, at the lives of the enslaved and try and work out what the options were in regards to the enslavers. It's difficult to do that because all the sources we have tend to come from the oppressors, from the enslavers, and very little come from the enslaved. But historians are working out ways whereby you can try and read between the lines and try and work out what enslaved people were doing, sometimes what they were thinking, in order to try and understand what the reality of enslaved life was like in 18th century and 19th century Jamaica.
So Trevor, this is the big challenge, and I'm sure that at some point you're going to accept the mantle. When can I get an article from you on gun trading during slavery? Because the slaves and also maroons had access to gun. How did they get access to guns? Well, if a planter would give a slave a gun to shoot an animal, this is one way by which slaves would get access to guns. The maroons had access to guns because of their partnerships with the enslaved community, and more than likely, some slaves would have stolen guns. This is also another possibility. But Thomas Thistlewood, he hints at a gun trade. It is not properly explicated in his article, in his writings, but he hints that slaves had access to guns and there was a trade.
Well, you might be waiting a little while for an article on me on gun trading, but someone should do it, and perhaps it should be me at some stages. In Thomas Thistlewood, there's a very poignant and dramatic incident, which I've cited in one of my books, of Thomas Thistlewood and about enslaved people having guns. His nephew, John, as a young man, comes to Jamaica and he drowns or is murdered. It's hard to tell. Drowns, and Thistlewood is very upset. But that night he hears commotion in the enslaved quarters going off while the enslaved people are celebrating the death of John Thistlewood. And finds this very problematic. But one of the things, of course, which is strange for those of us reading that particular extract is to think, well, my goodness, enslaved people had guns. They kept those guns and they were willing to fire them at this stage. So you have enslaved people who were sort of armed and dangerous in this. Of course, even if they don't have guns, they have things like machetes and things like that. So it's that enslaved people would have guns on a plantation goes against every rule of slavery that you ever thought existed, but they did have it.
Professor Bernard, are you saying that John Thistlewood was killed by an enslaved person?
He may have been. It's hard to tell. It's very
using a gun. Is this the implication?
He was drowned, whether he drowned accidentally or he was murdered, but certainly what we do know is that enslaved people celebrated his death. And it was one of those rare, James Scott talks about this, talks about what he calls the weapons of the weak. Mostly, and we do this in our own lives as well, we're very careful in talking to superiors who might harm us, and we watch our words, etc. And enslaved people always watching what they said. They were always watching how they said it, what they said it, because they never knew what enslaved people, what enslaved might do. But every now and then the mask slips, and you see what enslaved people actually thought. And this is one of those rare occasions where the enslaved people on Thistlewood's property, those enslaved people celebrating John Thistlewood's death, showed to Thistlewood that they didn't like him. they thought him his enemy. They celebrated when he was upset, which is interesting. Having said that, Thistlewood's lover and mistress and Phoebe was a source of great comfort to Thistlewood in this period when John Thistlewood died. So, like any human society, enslaved societies were complex creatures.
No, this is the big surprise, Professor Bernard. Do you know what undermines the cardinal rules of slavery? That enslaved people could actually have parties and planters were the patrons. No,
That's
this
right.
is shocking.
Well, it brings up the fundamental problem with slavery in general. I mean, enslavers, the people who own slaves, wanted to think of them as property. They list them in their inventories as Negroes alongside livestock. So they're thinking of them as cattle and those sorts of things. But enslaved people are more than just animals. They're humans and treated as humans the whole time. So in that contradiction between enslaved people being human and enslaved people being property is something that's not resolved within slavery. So certainly, you know, that enslavers have relationships with enslaved people in all sorts of ways. They go to parties with them, they work with them, they sleep with them, and enslaved people also have relationships with white people.
Yeah, but Trevor, enslavers did not just attend these parties. They were patrons. They actually appreciated African art forms and dances.
That's true. And they convinced themselves that they were good masters and that they were helping these things. And certainly, so you see things like at Christmas, they'll have a party and there'll be dancing and
the John Canoe Festival.
John Canoe, etc. All those sorts of things, and they're very interesting, aren't they? It brings in all sorts of things about cultural appropriation, but also places of danger. I mean, Christmas was the period which was the most dangerous for the enslavers because enslaved people get drunk, they have parties, they get together, and it's no surprise that around Christmas that you often have slave revolts.
And enslaved Africans could use their cultural art forms to convey revolutionary messages.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like their drumming. Matthew Lewis, he has some writings on the topic. He talks about slave rebellions and how they enjoy themselves. Matthew Lewis, he has an article on the topic.
Yes, and I certainly would recommend your listeners to look at Matthew Lewis because he portrays, I think, more than most of them, both the ways in which planters were very much unaware of what Africans were doing, but also the ways that they were. And you can read through that and see, and you can hint at least darkly at what enslaved people were thinking when they were trying to engage with Matthew Lewis. One of the ways we often think of slavery is that it's a negotiated relationship. The planters and the enslavers have most of the power, but not all of the power. And the enslaved people don't have much power, they do have some power, and they certainly have means whereby they can counter what their enslaved owners are trying to do. Which means it's a very, very interesting and complicated relationship. And one of the things I often think is that for an enslaved person, there's often a choice. And the choice is how close do you want to get to a white person? The closer you get, the more privileges you get. The more likely you might be, if you're a woman, for example, to have a sexual relationship and get freedom for yourself, and also for your mixed race children. If you're a driver, you're likely to get privileges within the slave community. Closer to whites you get, also the more likely you are to have to going wrong. So for many enslaved people, the choice might be, to avoid white people and not get those privileges, but not suffer the consequences of being close to white people.
And Trevor, the John Canoe the John Canoe event in history is also a meta-political project because
Absolutely.
slaves can employ their culture to plan revolts, and also by incorporating their culture, they're also mocking elite hegemony.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look at the clothes that they're worn, the fact they wear a house on their head.
Exactly.
All these things are mocking in all sorts of ways. They're employing characteristics, both African and Jamaican ways of mimicry, and of creativity as well. So for white people watching a John Canoe event, it's both hugely entertaining but a bit worrying at the same time. And what we know is what is clear is that the messages that different groups in the community are getting, whether they're white, free people of color, or enslaved, from events like John Canoe, from things which are African heritage, can be very different. So it makes Jamaica a very native place, which is something important back in the 18th century and which has continued right up to the present day.
And what is also significant about Jamaican culture is that Afro-Jamaican culture was diffused throughout the society.
That's right.
In Jamaica, European culture petered out. And even today, Jamaicans have created their own art forms. Classical music is not a big deal in Jamaica. European Afro-Jamaican culture survived, and this is why I usually become a bit troubled when some scholars argue that Jamaica is still at a disadvantage due to the legacy of cultural colonialism. I argue otherwise. My argument is that the colonial project on a cultural level died in Jamaica. It was not successful.
I tend to agree with you. I think maybe there are more legacies of colonialism than you might think. I mean, I would certainly suggest that Orlando Patterson's right to say that Jamaica, right from the very start of its settlement, has been an under-institutionalized place. In other words, that things of authority have been relatively small, but relatively unimportant. But I think in terms of cultural creativity, what you say is broadly correct. Is that the legacies of colonialism are one factor, but many other factors come into the legacies of Africa.
Yes.
The ways in which people, particularly Afro-Caribbean people in Jamaica, have adjusted to both slavery, emancipation, and
like
all with
the Anansi story is still popular in Jamaica.
That's right, and it makes for an extraordinarily rich environment. It's one area where Jamaica has always it's an extremely interesting society, more interesting than most societies in terms of the ways in which Jamaicans have been able to form all sorts of interesting cultural productions, be that in art, be that in music, be that in dance, which shows a very vibrant society.
No, Orlando Patterson has an interesting masterpiece comparing institutional development in Jamaica to Barbados, and I do agree with his conclusion. In Barbados, elites repose a greater sense of confidence in Black people, but yourself and Aaron Graham, both of you, have been producing scholarly works that challenge the thesis of Patterson. I've read your work and I've also read the articles of Aaron Graham. And based on what I have been reading, state capacity in Jamaica was not necessarily ineffective. You actually have an article titled Security, Taxation, and the Imperial System in Jamaica, 1721 to 1782.
That's right. Well, you're very up with my writings, which is very welcoming and quite humbling, but absolutely true. I mean, one of the reasons why Jamaica, for example, in the American Revolution, is that it's very happy with its relationship with the state. Jamaicans, or white Jamaicans anyway, pay a lot of taxes. They get a lot of support. They're very keen on having institutions of the state, such as the Army and the Navy. They're very keen to, quite willing to support Maroons because Maroons support their security. So in those ways, Jamaica is very keen on the state. Having said that, I think that Orlando Patterson has something, has a point in saying that on the plantations within the city of Kingston, there's a good deal of friction between enslaved people and white people, which is harder to control. Jamaicans need the state in some ways more than Barbadians do, partly because of the physical environment of Jamaica, all the mountains and diverse geographies of the place, the different cultural heritages of Africa. There's so many more. Jamaica is a heavily African place for a very long period, and those Africans come from a large area. A lot of those come from places with a heavy military tradition. Which means that white Jamaicans want the state because they need the state to deal with volatile situations on plantations and in the cities. So I think that Patterson is right in that way, but he also needs to I would also add into that what Aaron and I have been talking about in terms of white Jamaicans' reliance and on the state, welcomed state support and state discipline.
This is this parallel between your work and that of Patterson. Because Patterson is paying keen attention to Barbados, he's able to track the trajectory of a country that over time has created inclusive institutions that serve the interests of the masses. And these institutions are more inclusive because, as Patterson notes, Bayesian Blacks have procedural knowledge, whereas Jamaican Blacks inherited declarative knowledge. Bayesian Blacks possess the know-how. Jamaican Blacks have an idea of the know-how. So this is the parallel between your work and the work of Patterson. Jamaica inherited strong institutions, but they lack the know-how to improve them.
Well, it's an interesting take on Patterson. I think you quite well. I'm not quite sure what my view would be on that. I have to think about that one really, but it's very intriguing. I think one thing I would say is that Patterson and I agree in some ways, and in some ways we don't. I think I probably pay more attention to his work than most people do in terms of Jamaican slavery. And one of the reasons I would do so is what Patterson is interested in is in the same thing, the way that I'm interested in, is that we're both interested in slavery in Jamaica during the African period of slavery, while the slave trade was flourishing, and with the majority, perhaps 75 to 80% of the population were born in Africa. And we're also interested in that part of Jamaican history, the abolitionist or ameliorationist urge that became after the 1788 was not apparent. So we look at the period which I is the most brutal period of slavery in Jamaica, and so it's not surprising that both Patterson and myself tend to see Jamaican slavery in highly negative terms.
Yes.
Took me to task for that in an article he wrote in the American Stock Review, which I think is worth reading, and is criticism as well taken, I think, saying that both Patterson and I have a rather nihilistic view of Jamaican slavery.
So who critiqued you? Who did that?
Vince Brown. It's many years ago.
Vince Brown. So well, for me, yeah. So Trevor Burnard, you're a brilliant man, and I don't have a problem flattering you because I appreciate your work. But obviously, because of your insight, it is quite evident that my views on history and slavery in the Caribbean context are closer to the views of some people in Europe and North America.
I think that's probably, that does sound like what it's.
Yes, I'm a son of David Landis. I don't agree with all of his views on culture and economics, but in the realm of economic development, I'm on the side of the libertarian right in the States.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes. So whenever I hear Jamaican academics talk about colonialism, I often say, yes, colonialism is brutal, but that's the point of colonialism. Colonialism naturally is an extractive system. And wherever colonialism is practiced, it is brutal, but some of the effects of colonialism are positive. And noting the positive effects of colonialism cannot negate its negative effects.
Well, I think I agree with you on that.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I'm all for nuance in the historical debate, but my argument in relation to in relation to Orlando Patterson is the growth inducing effects of inegalitarian institutions. So institutions during slavery in Jamaica produce a growth inducing effect for whites. However, these institutions can become more inclusive, and if they become inclusive, then the benefits of economic growth are distributed across society. So the problem is not the institution, but it's growth inducing but it's growth inducing effects that are inegalitarian. If these institutions become inclusive, then the growth inducing effect in Black communities is positive.
I think I would agree with you. The difficult course is becoming inclusive.
It's just like Aaron Graham's paper on patenting in Jamaica. Relative to North American countries, Jamaica was fairly innovative.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I would love to get Aaron on the show.
Well, you should ask him. I think he'd be delighted to talk. I think he's one of the most
brilliant academics, brilliant young
historians.
academics. I like Aaron Graham, and I like Justin Roberts, Daniel Livesey. I don't think I'm pronouncing his name properly. And there's this other person, Radburn. Is it Nathaniel or Nathan Radburn?
Nicholas Radburn.
Yeah, Nicholas. Yes, I keep getting the first name wrong.
Yes, I think all of those are people I rate extremely highly, and I'd add Christine Walker to.
Yeah, Christine Walker. She's also excellent. Yeah, I was just about to say Brooke Newman. Yes.
Yes.
They're all excellent academics. So we're about to wrap up, but before we wrap up, I just want you to speak briefly on the merchant class in Kingston, because in your paper you also reference the merchant class in Kingston. Just speak briefly because we're wrapping up.
Okay. One thing I think we fail to we need to recognize a bit more is that, as well as very rich planters in Jamaica, there was a very heavy merchant class, and that merchant started off making much of its money through the slave trade, through shipping to Britain. One of the things I think is interesting is that the merchant class, unlike the planter class, managed to survive the abolition of the slave trade by reorientating itself in order to sell manufactured goods to Spanish America. And I think the Kingston merchant class, although it changes over time, is a remarkably resilient, remarkably innovative, and remarkably interesting group, and certainly deserves a lot more study, not only for the 18th century, but for the 19th century as well.
Yes, and not only the merchant class, but the realtor class. People would have owned property in Kingston. They would have operated taverns. And many of these, well, I shouldn't say many, but some of the more prominent people in the business were women. Women owned taverns. Some of them were women of color.
That's right. And some of the biggest owners of property in Kingston, the free women of color, some of whom owned 20, 30 buildings by the early 19th century, and made a lot of money just from the very expensive rents in Kingston. Kingston was probably the most expensive place in the world, both in terms of in terms of its foods. You paid a fortune to eat and live. You paid a fortune to entertain yourself, and you paid a fortune to live there. So you had to earn a lot of money in order to really enjoy yourself in Kingston.
Well, I'm yet to read this article, but I do know that you have a paper on social life in Jamaica, and you reference drinking. I'm yet to read it, but I'm also looking forward to consume more articles on leisure life in Kingston during slavery and after slavery, in particularly the leisure life of the elite in the period immediately after slavery.
Well, I do that as you mentioned, that article I've written talks about. So I'd be happy to talk with you about that hospitality in Jamaica on another day.
Yes, on another day.
And very much enjoyed this discussion, and I've learned a lot from it, as well as I hope I've something which is of interest to your readers.
Yes. Yeah, we could spend the entire day talking about Kingston, but I'm busy and you're busy. So unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But bye.
Thank you very much.
Yes. All right.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bye.